Afternoon, everyone, and we just like to say good afternoon and welcome to the RIPA Board Civilian Complaint Subcommittee meeting. I apologize as I'm still pulling up my reports right now. I'm just having a couple of technical difficulties. I know we're going to go over the report for last year, August, when we all came together in August. And we need to look at that report. There were some things put in there, I think on page 200, that we're probably going to have to go over and get everyone to agree to. Pastor?
Hello, everyone. I'd certainly like a motion to start our meeting. Or do we need a motion to start our meeting?
You do not. You can go ahead.
Jump in. Yeah, okay. We just need a motion to end the meeting. Okay. All right. I believe we have minutes that we need to approve. Is that correct?
Yes, I think so. Am I correct on that to say we need to go over our minutes first from the last meeting?
Yes, and just for everyone's sake, the agenda is linked in the chat as well. So yes, the first
Okay.
order of business is the
Before we get to
meeting there is the minutes from last time. And why don't you all do some introductions first so everyone knows who's on the phone for those who aren't on video.
Yeah, go. Okay.
My name is Lawanda, and I'm in Los Angeles, and I have been on the committee, the RIPA committee, for this will be my fourth year. This is my last year, and I have been very, very excited about being on this committee. It's been very enlightening. It has showed me so many things that I thought I knew, but I really didn't know. And I say thank you. It gave me information where I can go back and help my community now. And I say thank you for that. I truly appreciate this experience. But next person.
Well, I'll go next. I'm Brian Kennedy. I serve as senior pastor at Mount Zion Church of Ontario, and I am new to the board and appreciating the work of the board.
Any other board members?
I can jump in. My name's Bill Armeline. I'm the director of the San Jose State University Human Rights Institute and Criminal Justice Chair of Silicon Valley and San Jose NAACP. I'm a relatively new member to the RIPA board, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you.
Good
Anyone
afternoon,
else
everyone.
on?
Good afternoon, everyone. Cha Vang, and I am Deputy Director for AAPS Pacific Empowerment Education Fund, located in Oakland, but I'm actually in Sacramento. And this is also, one of the newer members.
Right on. Do we have any more board members on?
Not at this time. We're still following up with one of them. But there is a quorum, so you may all proceed.
Thank you. Okay, we need to approve the August the 30th subcommittee meetings. Do everyone have a copy of that? Do we all have a copy of the minutes from the last meeting from August?
Yes, I have it.
Any questions? Any questions regarding the August meeting? Are we all in agreement? Do we all agree on the minutes?
Do we have to do a motion?
I think we might have to because there's minutes. We
Okay.
might have to do that.
I'll motion to approve the minutes, the August meeting minutes.
I'm going to need someone to second it.
Second the motion.
Thank you. All right. Minutes approved.
Is anyone, does everyone approve? I know we didn't hear from LaWanda and Dr. Armeline. If everyone approves, okay. Dr. Armeline says yes.
I say yes.
Okay, great. Then the minutes are approved.
Now remember that report in August was 279 pages. Remember that, you guys. That's a big, big report. And we're all saying we're okay. The last 200 page 200 to 233 dealt with us. You want to take a minute before we say, because you might want to go to page 200 and look and make sure we all in agreement.
Clarification, we're approving the minutes of the August meeting. This is correct, not the report.
We're approving the minutes, but the minutes, don't the report go along with the minutes? No? Okay.
Yeah.
The report itself was published, so you're all approving the minutes that do go along with the subcommittee meeting that happened in August related to the report. So yes, it's related to the report, but the minutes are for the August meeting. And then the next item, so you all did approve the minutes, and so the next item would be a discussion of the next report for this year, the 2023 report.
Where do we want to go? Where do we want to go for 2023? Any suggestions?
In looking at the report that was just submitted, a lot of data, and we see where law enforcement agencies have their forms online, and some don't have it online as you look at the report. I'm wondering, do we just wait each year for them to fill out the survey to tell us if they have a system online or a fully blown system for civilians to come in and file a complaint? How do we follow up and ensure that every police station has that reporting system available to the public? That's a big question, but is that something we want to discuss?
I think we should, because that's very important. We do need to make sure that all law enforcement agencies in the state of California do have access to, the computer, that everything should be computerized now, especially in 2022.
Well, yeah, I'm just trying to see how do we follow up? How do we ensure that every citizen has an opportunity to file a complaint if they run into something or someone in law enforcement and they want to file a complaint? How do we ensure they can do that? Any ideas?
I'm not quite sure, because of COVID-19, there was a lot of restrictions put on the community with law enforcement, with contact with law enforcement because of COVID-19. We were not allowed to go into any of the police stations. There were signs put out to stations stating that if you needed assistance, you would have to have a phone. And to me, that might have been a problem for a lot of victims, because what if your purse was snatched and they took your cell phone? Then you were not able to make a complaint or anything. It created a problem. And I understand COVID-19, they were concerned, and I understand the issues behind it, but it created a problem with law enforcement and the community, I know, in LA County, because you couldn't communicate with them. You were not allowed because of COVID. All doors were locked. We were not allowed to go in. Any more comments? Where do we want to go for 2023? So what do we want to see for 2023? Do we want more ways of being able to communicate with law enforcement? What do we want to see?
I did a cursory look at the committee that oversees the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, and a lot of their work had to do with body cams to help provide more objective feedback, not only in the complaint process, but in anything that happens with law enforcement. I don't know if we want to somehow process that, think about that, or is that outside of our purview? Ellison, is that something that we can look at, how body cams can be used to provide objective feedback to citizens' complaints?
So I mean, one issue that this subcommittee has brought up before is looking at how civilian complaints are used in discipline. And so, body-worn camera footage could be something that the subcommittee, obviously, the board doesn't have access to the body-worn camera footage unless it's released by the law enforcement agencies. But some of these oversight commissions do, and some of them are working on, like the LA Office of the Inspector General. That was highlighted in the report, some of the reports that they've done in the past, and that was highlighted in the 2022 RIPA report, in looking at body camera footage and comparing it to the stop data. Now, I don't know if they then compared it to any complaints that were made, and that's something that the subcommittee could recommend. The challenge is just that the subcommittee doesn't have access, would be relying on others to do on their audits rather than, the subcommittee data that the subcommittee has access to. But that's certainly a recommendation that the subcommittee could make, and that I know has been discussed by this subcommittee in past years. So certainly, something the subcommittee could continue to look at are best practices around using complaints, in discipline systems, or use of complaints by any of the oversight commissions, that do some sort of oversight of the law enforcement agencies. I think one of the challenges for the subcommittee this coming year is to think about what you all, in the past, what the subcommittee has done is looked at all of the Wave 1 agencies and then Wave 1 and 2 agencies and looked at their complaint forms. As we get into Wave 3 and 4, there's a much greater number of agencies. After Wave 4, we're looking at 500 plus agencies. And so it's not really feasible to look at the complaint forms for all of the agencies. And so I think that's important for the subcommittee to talk about and figure out, is how you all want to move forward. We did a review of Wave 1, 2, and 3's complaint forms. So we've done it for many of the largest agencies. So just thinking about how you all want to proceed, and what areas you're all interested in looking at, that can get further in depth in some of these issue areas. And so just different various aspects of the civilian complaint process and what you all might be most interested in. And again, this year, we will, the report will also include the data on the civilian complaints and profiling. So that data is all submitted to DOJ. So the question is, other than the usual data analysis of the complaints and the number of complaints that are considered profiling complaints, what other areas are you all interested in exploring for this next
Easy
year?
access. easier access to complaints, because we here in the community, they don't have easy access. And a lot of people in the community who come encounter with law enforcement are very rare going to make a complaint unless there's easy access, unless they're told how to. Because if you think they're going to call the station and go through the desk person at the desk and they're going to give them the information, it's not going to work like that on the street. It needs to be easy access to these complaints forms, and we need to know what's being done after we make the complaint. Is anyone even looking at that? Because we don't get a response after you make a complaint. They're saying, oh, we're taking care of it, but no one's ever calls you back and you never get an email. We need to set up it needs to be something in place that people know that their voices are being heard when they make a complaint. Because when people don't think their voices are being heard, that creates another problem. That
Right.
creates a problem. You don't feel like you're valuable. Yeah. And like what happened to you, no one really cared. And and we want to know, people would like to know that. And how many complaints do you have against one individual in law enforcement? I think that needs to be looked at too.
Right. I know in the report, we recommended a process for everything you said to happen. And so we have several bullet points, including the definition of a complaint, which could be an individual. It could also be a department complaint, a complaint against an officer or the whole department. And so we made those recommendations. So I think what we're trying to do this year is figure out how do we hold departments accountable? How do we, like several of them have online forms. You can go online and fill out the complaint forms. All of them don't. There are several departments that don't have that ability at this time. And so that's an issue. I think I want to go back, though, and revisit this body cam matter. As you look at the report, some of the complaints were sustained, and some of them were denied, some of them were thrown out, some of them. So you have a different outcomes. And what I'm thinking, and I want to hear from the committee, if a citizen complains that an officer was disrespectful, called them out of name, vulgar language, can, in that complaint adjudication process, can we recommend that the body cam the officer was wearing be brought to bear, where in that process, someone reviews the body cam to see if the officer actually used that language, to see if the officer called that person out of name, and be incorporated in the investigation. So that's kind of what I want to ask the committee. Is that something we want to incorporate in our recommendations this year? If it hasn't been done. Allison, I know it's been discussed. Has it been done? Have we at some point made that specific recommendation?
I don't believe the subcommittee's made that explicit recommendation. I think there's been discussion of the use of complaints in early intervention systems and other discipline systems, but it was an introductory discussion. So I don't think the subcommittee and the board has, come out with an explicit recommendation about that.
All right. And I know in discussing body cam equipment with leaders in law enforcement, one of the pros is that it protects the officer from ill will in the community and false accusations. but it also protects the citizens. So when a citizen says, hey, this happened, and it's recorded, it's substantiated, and it helps citizens. And so maybe we could put that on the table. What do the rest of you all think about that?
I think that's awesome because it clears both parties. Because sometimes when you're having complications with somebody, you might think you heard something, but they might not have said it or did that. So when you got a camera, you both are able to go back and look at both of your actions. So I think it's a good thing for both parties. It bridges the gap that we have in the community with law enforcement. I think it only can do is help.
Rest of the committee, will you weigh in on that?
And I think that's, I think we can definitely explore that. If there's a standard way we can actually explore that piece, I think it could be I support like kind of moving that forward for this next round. I also wanted to kind of bring back or kind of take us back to the complaint forms, and I was just wondering, is there no I think there's a conversation about like how access to complaint forms are how the public gets access to the complaint form, that with the knowledge that there are communities who have broadband problems. There's also language, families who don't speak English, but also, and so is there how does departments go about having paper form, and with in light of COVID, and not having a very limited ability to actually allow people inside of police stations, how are community members getting access to in-person reporting or to do paper reports, right? That I don't know if we were able to kind of explore it, since this is but I think the other piece to move forward in terms of this conversation is the data around the deterrent languages. I know we have kind of taken a look at, like, examine some of the department's complaint forms and the language that it includes. What is the data? If we can pull some data, and I mean, this is for maybe next year's report, like ability to kind of see in departments that have in their complaint forms have the deterrent language in, what is the number of complaints per year that they get, right? So just to kind of really see if that deterrent language is like a key factor to having a low number of community members filing complaints, would be something I think for us to also take a look at. But in addition to other factors why the number of complaints are low in different departments, right?
I think that's a good point. I believe in our recommendation, we explicitly asked that deterrent language be removed from the complaint forms. And so the question would be, how many departments actually remove the language? And so, Allison, when we make a recommendation, does that mean each department is required to remove that language in this case?
It does not, because the board is just an advisory board. So if the legislature were to make that law, then the agencies would be required to remove the language. But as of now, it's just a board recommendation. And you all have written a letter to the legislature twice about this recommendation. And so, that is with the legislature. We have not, I know as part of the review of the complaint forms, We did look at whether the complaint forms did contain the language. We did not look at it longitudinally to see whether they had it one year and then removed it next year. I think that's something the subcommittee could look into. I think part of the challenge is, talking with agencies about, when exactly they remove the language, because obviously we can look up their most recent policies or follow up with them about their most recent policies. And that was part of the review of all of the complaint forms, was whether that language was contained in them. But agencies as of now are still, some agencies do still have contain that language within their forms. I do think, we can't trace the causation. I do think there are some agencies that probably did remove the language based on the RIPA board's recommendation, but it would be challenging to determine, when in time that happened and whether it was in response to the recommendation. So it's certainly something you all can discuss, thinking about how to get at that. And it's something that the survey did. I think, again, the challenge a little bit would be with Wave 4, you have 500 plus agencies reporting. And so it would be a huge undertaking to look at the forms of all of those agencies. Because just looking at 22 or 38, is something that staff would work on the entire year in terms of following up with, the agencies on. So, but if there's, sorry.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Please.
I was just going to say that, so I think the challenge is figuring out how else that you all might tackle, the same themes obviously come up for the subcommittee every year in terms of access to the complaint forms, in terms of any deterrent language on the complaint forms. And so, in terms of the definition of complaints, which is also something that the subcommittee addressed last year. And so I think, the challenge and the sort of creative thinking here is how to continue to get at some of these questions, that the subcommittee is interested in, that might not be in the same way that we've tackled them in the past.
All right. So, Board Member Vang.
Yes.
What do you think about maybe identifying the largest police departments and the departments that have the most complaints, racial profiling complaints, to see what their forms look like? What are your thoughts? Maybe that's a little more doable. I'm
not that interested of seeing how they form. I think my interest is to see if there are organs or station or departments that do that the complaint forms don't have any deterrent language in it. What is the relationship to that in terms of the number of complaints they get per year, right? So if we want to pull a few departments that have a deterrent language in the complaint forms versus a few departments that who do not have deterrent language in their complaint forms, if we can pull data to kind of really emphasize the need to make sure that language is actually it should not be included, to make sure that community members feel safe enough to make those complaints, right? And so this is the data in relationship to those two pieces, right? Of the deterrent language and the number of complaints a department gets, right?
What if we target a certain group to study that? And the question would be, what group? Is that group the largest departments and ones with the most RIPA complaints? Or, how do we define that group? And that group might be, instead of 500 plus groups or off departments, maybe it's 50 to 100. Maybe we do a smaller sample and see if we get anything out of that, which can beef up our notion that this language, this prohibitive language, should be removed.
Mm-hmm.
So your thoughts on maybe a smaller sample group?
Yeah, I think a smaller sample is fine. I perfectly understand that with the 500 plus departments now, that it might not be realistic. But if we can if we can focus a number of agencies and departments, I think that would be good for us to pull some data. I think, as have mentioned, that this recommendation to take out this language has been ongoing recommendation for legislative policies, and as an advisory board, that what is the additional things that we can actually do to make sure that we have a strong additional data to make sure that this recommendation is stronger for our legislative members to pay attention to, right?
Yeah. So maybe this study will inspire them to move forward, And so I think this group would have to decide, how large is this sample group? Is that 50 departments? And so that's two items that we're actually possibly three items for our agenda this year. But the rest of you, your thoughts on just having a sample group, doing a study, hoping the study will give us information to move the legislature forward on this, on passing a law to remove the language, prohibitive language. Alex, what are your thoughts?
This is Lawanda, board member Lawanda, and I wanted to raise, maybe we might want to raise uniformity with civilian complaint review boards. That is, should be some uniform there. Instead of every agency doing, having their own complaint form and one saying this on it, it should be uniform throughout the state. Maybe legislation could come up with that one form for everyone for the civilian complaint. So we know what we're looking at. Well, one person is saying this and that doesn't say that. So we don't know if people were complaining about that and it just didn't get in. It just wasn't reported.
Right.
And sometimes the most effective way is having an independent investigative authority with subpoena powers to make people turn over these records. So we can really look at them, because we need to know, because we need to bridge that gap between law enforcement and the community. And the only way we can do it is being upfront with everything and going through it. If there's a problem, let's talk about it. Let's see what we can do to help work it out, because law enforcement and the community, we have to work together as one. And we won't do that if we are there's issues that we haven't discussed and brought forward. And the only way we will be able to do that is bring it. We have to know what is the problem.
Right. I agree. We should take our recommendation to standardize this form statewide, which was in our recommendation in the report. But to move legislators, we got to have a little more. Apparently, we have to have a little more research or something to push them forward, because they've not responded to this letter we've sent, what I think it was twice already, if I remember right, requesting that this language be removed. And so I think, Board Member Vang, we're on to something here. We get a sample group, get something out of that study that says, hey, we need to remove this language for this reason. Here's the results of this study. And then once we get that study, then we can push to have the form without the language standardized throughout the state. But removing the language is a big hurdle, and so the study can help us overcome the hurdle, perhaps, maybe.
It shouldn't be that hard because we have law enforcement on the RIPIC board, and they can look at the reports and say what needs to be in there and what doesn't need to be in there. I trust the law enforcement on the RIPIC board because they're looking out for all. And so I think we need to have them, and then those on the board who are attorneys can go through it and look at it. What needs to be there to protect us all? Because we have to protect law enforcement too. We cannot be taking things out and put them in danger. And so we need to have someone in law enforcement look at it as well as the community, as well as us. But we do need to look at that form this year. We need to try our best to get some of that stuff taken out this year. It needs to be removed.
Okay. All right.
This is a question to the staff. Is the only data we have access to are from the departments, the police departments, or is there any points, additional points of data that we can pull outside and be able to also make a comparison? I think I'm just like relying solely on that form of data is like it could be also, as mentioned, that we don't know if it's all the things that we can be gathering, or is there other points or some other data sources that we can actually access to make some clear comparison about complaints that might be different from the ones that are like being directly made to the police departments, right?
So Kevin may be able to speak additionally to this, but the only data that the DOJ receives, for that's really relevant to this question is the data from the agencies reporting on their complaints every year. So they do have to report on the numbers of civilian complaints. They have to report on the outcomes of those complaints, and they have to report on whether the complaints had to do with racial and identity profiling. And so that's something that, that's what, and then beyond that, we have had staff who have followed up with every agency to get copies of their forms if they are not online, and to look at the language in all of their forms against the best practices that the subcommittee came up with early on, in previous reports about what should and should not be contained in the reports. But that's really the data that, we have access to. And I did want to, I'll let Kevin speak a little bit more to that.
Thanks, Allison. Yeah, no, I just offering a couple, I guess, pieces of information about the data that the department possesses on civilian complaints. So yes, as Allison said, the data that the department has for agencies reporting across the state is the civilian complaints against peace officers, CCAPO data. That's what's required to be included in the board's report for analyses in these reports each year. That information is also available online. The data is available online at Open Justice, but it contains like raw counts per year received, and then how many, reported. How many of the reported complaints contained an element, a complaint about racial or identity profiling, and then information about the determinations about the complaints, whether they were sustained, not sustained, et cetera. So that's the data that the department has. Those data are reported by law enforcement agencies, so they do come from law enforcement agencies. To speak to your concern there, board member Fang, they are reported by law enforcement agencies. That's the only data source for this information that the department has access to. Information about deterrent language, et cetera, as Allison mentioned, were things that we've looked at in the past by doing the legwork and doing outreach and working with agencies to obtain that information from their complaint forms, ask them follow-up questions, et cetera. So that's kind of a resource-intensive task to take upon. I know that Allison has mentioned doing that for some number of agencies each year has been like a multi-month task for collecting information from agencies about their policies. And so those are just some considerations there. We've also got, and the board has discussed this in previous years, and so this isn't news to anyone, but there's still the issue of there not being a standard complaint definition, which can affect what agencies are reporting as complaints. We've seen that in years past in outreach to agencies and seeing changes in their data. And reaching out, and it turns out that they were at one point considering something to be a complaint for the purpose of data collection and reporting purposes, and then brought their definition of what they'd collect data on more in line with what other agencies were doing, and then that changed their numbers of complaints that they're reporting. And so we do not yet in this state have a standard definition that's been adopted across groups, and so it makes examinations of the data a bit more difficult because we're not using standardized measures when looking at complaint counts, unfortunately. And so that has been a roadblock and a barrier, I think, to a lot of interpretation surrounding the data that's collected, in that it is not collected in a uniform manner. I think those are the points that I wanted to make as far as clarification there, but I'm around for other questions.
Thank you, Kevin. I also just wanted to bring up Dr. Armelin had commented in the chat about coming up with baseline standards or a model. Dr. Armelin, I don't know if you're able to speak to that and explain a little bit more about your perspective on that. I'm not sure if you meant a model form or some other model, so I'll let you clarify.
I think, I'm personally open to it. I was just trying to find a way to move forward, given the conversation that was happening earlier, when we were all trying to figure out sort of what we wanted to shoot for the coming year. And it seems that, that's one way that we could sort of consolidate some of these conversations, is to come up with, if not a model or a model form, I don't know if it's even a form that you want to go for, but maybe at least some baseline standards, like what would a civilian complaints process and ideally look like? What are the baseline standards that would have to be there? That would provide some more flexibility for folks, or we could just give a straight model, be like, this is kind of the way it should look. That's all I was trying to say with that.
So that is certainly something, if the subcommittee is interested in exploring, best practices. I know the subcommittee has looked at the forms in the past and, come up with best practices as to what should be on the forms. I don't think, other than introducing the idea, the subcommittee has not really delved into the process of, considering civilian complaints and responding to them. And so that's something that the subcommittee could look into in terms of the process and procedures and best practices around that. I know.
Yeah.
And
I guess that's one point I could speak to. In my experience in working with several organizations that are all, system impacted families, basically, I can tell you that, my experience is what folks are really interested in is whether or not there's an appropriate power relationship here. In other words, whether doing any of this means anything. In other words, does it mean anything at all to fill out a form? What is ultimately the relationship between, the law enforcement agency, the public they police? These processes are supposed to be a check on, and sort of a check on that power balance. And just to be very honest with you, I think we should all sort of agree that in many cases that isn't the case, right? And we can't really even tell people what happens to these forms once they're submitted. And I would imagine that that's more of what the public is concerned about, rather than, I don't know, the formatting on the form or whatever. So I would be interested in that broader conversation, and much less interested in wordsmithing their form, because frankly that's what people are actually interested in, and probably what our job is here, what they would expect us to be doing with our time. But that's just my view. I mean, who knows?
Good. Baseline process. Lay out a baseline process. And what would be fun is doing more to making recommendations to the legislatures, figuring out how to get them to make it law. So we do all this work and submit it to them. How do we enforce it? And so that'd be a cool process as well.
I think, I just wanted to add in, the subcommittee did start to explore, I think, for the 2021 report and the 2022 report. I always have to check myself because we're in 2022 working on the 2023 report. But for the 2020 and 2021 reports, the subcommittee, started to explore, early intervention systems and processes around those and using complaints at those. So that may be just one aspect of this idea of figuring out and thinking about a baseline process. So that could be just one branch of thinking about overall what should be part of the process. And we, if you're all interested, the subcommittee could, think about how different agencies are using complaints and look at that and, examine what agencies are doing and then determine what you all think would be the best practices around that.
Could the civilian complaint reports go directly to the civilian complaint committee instead of to law enforcement, to their agencies? Because sometimes when you look at your own people stuff, it could be a little, yeah. But if you send it to someone else, then people won't be questioning the integrity of the information. So could it be done like that? Can we suggest that? That the form should go directly to a civilian complaint review board?
Yeah, Member Hawkins, how are you? Yes, that is something that we started exploring last year. There are, there are agencies. I'm working with San Francisco. San Francisco has its own Department of Police Accountability, where one of their sole functions is to investigate civilian complaints out of, by the police department, against the police department. And then they make recommendations for discipline and other issues to the San Francisco Police Commission. So that civilian complaint advisory bodies are definitely something that we started to explore. And I think that sounds like to me something that you're interested in following up on as well. Another thing that struck me when you were having this discussion is, how do we know, what these outcomes and what what are their processes in place after they receive the complaints? And so, I think we started to do a little bit of that, as Allison mentioned, but we could make those stronger, and we could look at those systems and make, stronger recommendations around, when you get the complaint, letting people know and having processes in place for notifying the public about the status of their complaints. We are working with agencies that we've entered into settlement agreements with, and we are, requiring those agencies, and I'm talking about the DOJ has entered into settlement agreements, and so we're requiring those agencies to provide letters to the public and updates. San Francisco, I think, it has a pretty good system in place because it's this extra, it's a different agency. So we can definitely do those. And then another thing that struck me in looking at some of the data is that it looked to me that there may be agencies that are not reporting civilian complaints. And this may go to the issue of the definition, because there are agencies that have very little complaints from what you would expect of an agency of the size. If you just look at some of the charts that we did in last year's report, you'll see some of the bigger agencies seem to have very low numbers of civilian complaints overall, and then even lower numbers of racial identity profiling being reported. So that might be something we could examine as well, because it's not necessarily that they don't have those complaints, and maybe the way they're characterizing them, which gets to your point, Member Hawkins. So those were some of the things, I think that we could follow on from last year, and it'd be a way to kind of incorporate your idea of doing a review of certain agencies, but it may be a way to target or at least figure out those agencies that we want to actually review and look at a handful of those and say, look, you would expect, I'm going to say it, the Alameda County Sheriff should have more complaints probably against them than they did in 2020. And so let's take a look and kind of see if we can look at their form and look at their system and find out why that might be. So that might be an area where we could look at, some of those. I don't know if looking at 50 to 100 is even doable, but I think looking at a few and finding out what's going on in those agencies will help, make recommendations that other people can be, use and apply across the board.
Thank you.
Do I hear 4 areas of focus this year? I'm trying to see if that's what I'm hearing. The baseline process with minimum items on a complaint form. That sounds like one area of focus. Body cam data used in adjudicating citizen complaints. Let's see. Receive at least copies of the civilian complaint forms. They may retain a copy for themselves, each department, but at least our getting a copy would certainly provide accountability. And then I believe the other one, and Nancy just addressed it, this sample group to study how the language on or not on the form affects citizen complaints. Is that what I'm hearing? 4 areas?
Yes, Pastor. Now, are we still talking about a standardized complaint form? Because if everyone has their own different one, every different agency, that is a problem.
Yeah.
Because we can't figure out, what line is supposed to be on, how they're handling it. We're going to have to recommend to legislation. They're going to have to step in and help with that. They're going to have to come in and sit down and come up with something that we, as the people, can agree on and say it's okay and accept when it comes to filing a complaint against a law enforcement agency. Because if you don't, we're back in the same position. It's like we didn't file anything.
Right.
And we're 7 years in. We want a standardized report. We have to ask legislation to take a minute out and help us to come up with one. Like you said, maybe we need to look at all the other reports coming from all these different law enforcement agencies and sit down and say, this is the report we want to see.
I agree. And I believe the baseline process will have a form incorporated with the minimum items. To be frank, police departments remind me of churches. Nobody wants to be told what to do. with their department. And and so, so if we at least have um, a minimum of items we want on that complaint form, and then departments can have the, if you will, independence in doing their forms. And so at least the minimum items on that form gives us the standardized data to make some sense out of our reporting and make our reporting a lot easier. So I want to note that I summarize everyone's concerns properly so we can have a focus for this year.
Yes, for me, Board Member LaWanda. Oh, one more
Okay.
thing, Pastor, I just got to ask. Is there a way we can recommend, instead of law enforcement looking at their complaints, that those complaints go to a civilian oversight committee? Because when you let other people, when you allow people to evaluate their own self, it could be a little, it could be,
Right.
yeah, it's questionable.
Right.
But
Right.
we need to recommend that all complaints go to a civilian review board, because if they come into that agency that you're complaining about, it could be a problem on how we see the reports in the end.
So you're recommending every department have a civilian review board for complaints, or is that a
It has to be someone to
regional board or something?
we got to talk to DOJ. How can that be handled? Because you cannot expect law enforcement to oversee their own self when it comes to complaints. That's not going to work. The community's not going to accept that. They're not going to accept it. They're going to say nope. It's still a problem. So it has to be a civilian outside committee that works with law enforcement, and law enforcement's put people there, DOJ, community put people there, but that we have a fair chance that somebody's looking at it, and we all can say, okay. But without it, if we allow law enforcement to do it, people are not going to go for that. And if it's somebody that the mayor, for instance, has appointed, and he appointed the chief of police, people are not going to go for that either, because that same person are all connected to the mayor. Yeah. So we need someone separate from that.
Well,
So
Allison, that's one of the hotbed questions in the state, the
yeah,
citizen review boards.
yes, and I did want to add that the Policies and Accountability Subcommittee is exploring that issue this year and looking at the different models. So I don't know, if they will end up recommending in particular, one model, but they're looking into exploring as part of the accountability measures, and that's where I think that subcommittee and this subcommittee definitely overlap in terms of accountability. But they are exploring different models of oversight. And so, one thing that we can research and present to the subcommittee, it does sound like you're all interested in hearing about, and thinking about and looking at research on a baseline standardized process and perhaps a baseline standardized form as well. I think is what I'm hearing, but you can all confirm that. But one thing you can all, end up, once you look at the research and recommending, is that, as Nancy said, the civilian complaints go to a particular part of the SFPD, that is looking at those complaints. So you may all end up deciding to recommend that the civilian complaints that are made are sent to whatever oversight body it is. You may end up making the particular recommendation that LaWanda mentioned as well. So, we can certainly look at and research those issues of, whether these certain oversight boards are looking at civilian complaints and how they're using them, whether within the agencies, the early intervention systems and other systems the agencies are using, the sort of two sides of whether they're being used for discipline, and that goes to the body cam footage, Pastor Kennedy, that you mentioned, and what the process is within the agency for handling complaints, and then also what the process is for civilians who make the complaints. So it's sort of from the both perspectives of the agency perspective of what happens when a complaint is made, and then from the civilian's perspective, what happens when they make a complaint and where does that complaint go and what the process is for that complaint. And so that may involve different aspects like the body cam footage. It may involve the complaints getting sent to whatever oversight model there is within an agency, because different agencies have different models, and different models may work differently, depending on the agency themselves and how they're set up. And so that is something in terms of the actual form and model of the oversight board. It is something that the policy subcommittee is going to look further into this year. They sort of started looking at it last year with civilian boards, community advisory boards and civilian oversight boards and other forms of oversight boards. And so that's something they're going to continue to explore this year.
That's
So,
awesome.
what are we going to settle on in this meeting?
I think, Pastor, the 4 things that you had outlined in the beginning, I think we need to talk about those and see what the public thinks about it.
Okay.
Public comments. See
All
what
right.
they think
So
about the 4 things. We got to ask. We need to ask Nancy.
this baseline process, I believe the body cam data to adjudicate complaints is probably included in that process. So we probably can get these items into the process and settle on a baseline process with a baseline form. And I want to hear what you all have to say about that.
I think that's awesome. I think we do. It needs to be incorporated.
Other members?
Can you repeat that again? Can you repeat the recommendation?
Okay. That this baseline process will have the minimum standards for what happens in a civilian complaint from both ends, from the community's end, from the department's end, and incorporated in that process will be a form with minimum, I think it's called data points, or minimum items of information we want on the form. And the process will also include, I don't know if it includes these complaint forms and where the complaint, I would say it should include where the complaint forms go to an outside group as well as internally. We might want to incorporate that in. And there's another subcommittee that their work is going to determine what kind of community review boards we'll have. Is that accurate, Allison? Will that subcommittee determine what kind of review boards we'll have?
I don't know if they'll end up making a determination. I think it will depend on, the research about the different types of boards, and it may be that a recommendation could be that law enforcement agencies choose from a number of different models that best fit their own community. They may have a specific recommendation about the type of model. For example, they may also say, whatever model you use, make sure there's a community member on it. So, it can be different. It may be different models. I don't know if they'll make a specific determination, but I think if you all are interested in making, I think there are some of you who are on the policy subcommittee as well. So that can be something that can be brought in if you all have specific recommendations about what needs to be addressed by those oversight boards. That can be something that the policy subcommittee can consider as well. And obviously we can help relay that information to them as well.
Okay. So I think those items, the process would include those items minimum, and then this study, this sample group, to look at how the language on the form is affecting the community or civilian complaints. I believe that might be a separate item. And so we might actually have two items here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for kind of repeating that. I think I'm good with it. I just want to, with the preference that when we get closer to the year, as we go into the year, that we revisit, because I think at the moment we're looking at items that we want to kind of take a look at for next year. And, I think this is a part of the recommendation piece of what we want. We would recommend for further process. And so I think just everything you said was, I feel good about it. I just want to make sure that we, as we get further into the year, we want to come back and put a little more detail into some of those recommendations in relationship with all the subcommittees that are having the same kind of conversation, and how we can actually make it stronger. And so just a little more details around about that process, I think would be good as we move forward. Yeah.
All right.
Could I ask a question? In terms, so Cha, are you saying that maybe we should hold off on the study for now, and we're focused on these other points?
Oh no, I'm not saying that. I think it sounded more like as board member Kennedy was kind of repeating it. It sounded like there was a lot of recommendations, and so I think for you all to continue with that study, and so that we can actually bring a little more details into the recommendations that are coming out. Yeah.
Okay, and then I guess I'm not 100% clear. I know you want to look at. I know what you want to look at. You want to look at whether, because there are some agencies that have that admonition that the board has recommended be removed because that's a deterrent. There are also agencies that don't have the recommendation at all because there is that conflict in the law, and some agencies have decided to remove that in order to comply with federal law. So there are two types of agencies out there. There's those that do have it and who don't. So what do you want us to do in terms of the study? What do you want us to look at? What do you want us to compare? And what is I know what your goal is, to see if it's a deterrent, but how do you want us to do that? That's my question.
I can start. I think it'd be good. I don't know if it would be a significant number in terms of like the number of complaints that are made per according to whatever the department's language is on their forms. I would say that is like the one piece we can start in terms of like what is in comparison, what is the numbers that are being reported, right? I think there might not be a significant difference, but it'd be good just to kind of see. And then as we at the moment, that's like the first thing that at the top of my head. But I think as you all are also taking a look at it, there's like any significant findings in that. I think we can explore that a little more. But at the moment, I wanted to see the relationship between the language and the number of complaints that are coming in, right?
So I'm thinking then, thank you for that clarification. That's really helpful. So I'm thinking that maybe one place to start would be to look at the numbers of those agencies where we've already done the matrices, and then look at those because we already have evaluated all of those agencies' civilian complaint forms, and so we know what's contained in them. And then we can look at those numbers and see how they compare and then bring those back to you. Does that sound good? Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, I was looking at the report. Yeah, no, that sounds good. Thank you.
Great.
And would you also, just a further clarifying, because that was going to be my question too, because I was actually just looking at the 2022 report, and yes, the language from Penal Code 148.6, the Wave 1 through 3 agencies have all been evaluated for whether they contain that language that you all determined was deterrent language. So we can look at that and then compare that to the number of complaints. We won't receive all the complaint data until a little bit later in the year. So one question is whether you'd all at the next subcommittee meeting like us to look at that compared to last year's complaint data as a starting point. And then you can all determine if you want to make that comparison once we have this year's complaint data. So, that's partly the question, is that we can look at those now for last year's complaint data, since we looked at last year's forms as well for the Wave 1 through 3 agencies, and then there are a few Wave 4 agencies that already started reporting. So we have the information about whether or not they have that deterrent language. And then we can compare that to their complaints, since those were both from last year, and then present you with that information at the next subcommittee meeting.
I think that would sound good. Yeah. Thank you.
I've got a quick question, Allison. Just thinking about the data collection about civilian complaint forms across years, across waves. If memory serves, some of this has been handled as the waves came on. So when Wave 1 was coming on, agencies complaint forms from that wave, and then Wave 2, same thing up through Wave 3 last year. Do we have each of these years, has there been updates to the previous waves? So if we were looking at 2020 data, I'm curious to know if we'd be using information about the complaint forms collected, like say during, I don't know, whenever we're looking at Wave 1's forms in a previous year. Do we update whether they have language on their forms annually, or so are we looking at the same point in time about forms across years, or?
Yes, so what the reports have done was, so in the 2019 report, in the 2021 report, the board looked at Wave 1 and 2 agencies. And then in the 2022 report, the board looked at Waves 3 and 4. And so so that data was looked at in batches. So Wave 1 and 2 were looked at for the 2021 report, and Waves 3 and 4 were looked at for the 2022 report. So we could, Waves 1 and 2, frankly, there were 15 agencies, so we could also take a quick look to see if that information has changed from the year we looked at it, to last year so that we're looking at just the complaint data for last year. So we did that update with policies, but now with the complaint form. So we could do that update and look at the complaint forms for years 1 and 2 to see, look at whether they had deterrent language, and the ones that did have a deterrent language, see whether they've removed it in last year's forms, basically. So that's an update that we could do.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that might be worthwhile just so we have kind of a standardized time period that we're looking at, which also may require some follow-up with the agencies, though, if they did update their forms, finding out when it was that they did that. So we'll see how that process goes as far as like when the next round of subcommittee meetings get scheduled for and what we're able to provide at that point based on the outreach there. But yeah, thanks for answering that question. I was just thinking about that.
All right. Well, anything else that we need to look at this year? I think we've bitten off a nice chunk. All right, LaWanda, I will turn it back over to you. I'm not sure where we want to go from this point, if we have what we need to work on this year.
I think we have a lot. I think we need to ask the public. We need to get the public's comments on this. Am I correct, Allison?
Yes, if you're ready to open it up for public comment, that sounds great.
Are we?
I'm fine. I'm open.
Okay. Other committee members, are we ready?
And there is additional time to discuss next steps after you take public comment. So if there's anything additional that comes up from what the public comments raise, then you all do have some time to discuss. And we're also running early on meeting time, so I think you're all okay for time.
Okay, great. Okay, let's open it up to the public. Let's hear your comments. What do you think?
So it looks
You
like
heard our recommendation.
Sorry, Luanda. I was just going to say, it looks like Michelle Wittig is up first, has her hand raised and is ready to give public comment.
Great, great. Thank you so much, board members. I have 5 topics to quickly suggest that you consider in addressing the complaints process. They are intake, investigation, adjudication, communication, and reporting to the DOJ. So quickly, the intake process obviously consists of some consideration of the form, both its content and its accessibility. It also involves the modes of submitting complaints: in person, via email, US mail, etc. And thirdly, the integrity of the intake process, ensuring that all complaints that are received get into the system. The second step is the investigation. Some of the challenges I think that some departments face is that those who investigate by interviewing the complainants often are 2 or 3 or 4 year rotators who go back to being officers of some of those officers that they're asked to investigate, and I think that could create a conflict of interest. The third topic is the adjudication. In my experience in Santa Monica, there really isn't any oversight on the chief's decision. If the chief decides to discipline an officer, the officer can appeal to a personnel board. But if the chief decides not to discipline an officer, there's really no recourse for the community member within the system of boards and commissions. So it's asymmetrical in that respect and very much favors the officer. The fourth topic is communication. Uh, Sometimes you can go 2 or 3 years with no response. The chief may retire and you still don't have a response and you don't really know what happened to your complaint. But the fifth one I think is particularly important to this group, and that is in reporting complaints to the DOJ, the department somehow makes a determination as to whether or not the complaint is within the purview of the RIPA Act. In other words, is this complaint based on racial or identity considerations? The department may decide that 90% of its complaints are of a different type and only submit those complaints which it decides is under the purview of the board. And that's a big challenge. For example, the Coalition for Police Reform in Santa Monica monitored several different racial and identity board complaints that were known to us in a particular year. And when we examined what our department submitted to the DOJ, only one of those complaints was categorized that way, whereas more complaints were actually racial and identity related. So those are big challenges, and I appreciate this subcommittee wrestling with them. And thanks for the time for the public input.
Any more comments from the public?
Richard Hilton has raised his hand and is coming on for comment. Mr. Hilton, please go ahead.
Buttons here. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I'm really quite disappointed, and I'm not sure why we're here. We have been here before. We were here last year. We were here the year before. And we were here the year before that. I recall distinctly that there was a discussion on these very same matters when the board visited San Diego. And it was the last time that I drove an automobile. I drove out to where you met, and I met Miss Algott in the parking lot. And the reason why I drove out there was because we were talking about these things, and we should not have been talking about these things, because the Ninth Circuit had made a decision which decision should rule. I do not understand how it is that police departments decide on which laws they will obey and which ones they shall ignore. It has been made clear, and I think it is binding, and we have a bunch of lawyers here who know it, that a decision made by a federal court trumps decisions made at the state level. You all know that. So why are you wasting my time and your time with these discussions? Tell them. The Attorney General has the power to tell them that they need to remove the intimidating language from their forms. That is not difficult. And it must be done. It should be done. And you are wasting my time unless you do it. Ms. Bellinati, I'm speaking to you directly. Thank you.
Do we have any more comments from the community? Public comments?
And if there are folks who cannot raise their hand, if they're just on the phone, feel free to unmute yourself and speak up if you'd like to make a public comment.
Northern California? Southern California? Central California, Eastern California. No more comment reports, public comments. So we've heard from the public. We got their comments. So as the committee, what will be our next step? For 2023. We have heard from Pastor Brian. He has given us an outline of 4 items he would like for us to take on. So what do you say, committee? Are we going to take those 4 items on this year for 2023? I can't hear. I'm sorry.
No one's saying anything. Dr. Armelin is saying yes. And I think I just wanted to confirm that
Okay.
I think you've all, it's my understanding, because I want to make sure before the next subcommittee meeting that we've sort of narrowed them down to 2, because some of the subparts to what Pastor Kennedy mentioned are kind of encompassed in this process. So my understanding, you're all interested in best practices for this baseline process with minimum standards and a minimum accounting of what elements should be contained on the complaint form, and looking at, and that's where includes where the complaint form should go, what happens from the department end and the community end, and perhaps incorporating this body-worn camera footage, depending on, where in the process you all think it belongs. And then this other review of the wave 1 through 4 agencies for which we've already done a survey of their deterrent language, and looking at, for the agencies that whose forms do contain that language, looking at the complaints for that same year, for last year, for both the number of complaints and the deterrent language, to see if there's any pattern from those. So that's my understanding, but I wanted to make sure from all of you that that's correct.
I say yes.
Thumbs up for me.
Okay, great. And you all can consider, and we'll look at the research, taking into account the public comments as well in terms of the different categories. And we can discuss with the co-chairs ahead of the next subcommittee meeting, what research we've been able to do and analysis we've been able to do on the complaints, and thinking about setting up the next subcommittee meeting to present to you the information that we've been able to research at that point.
Very good.
Wonderful. Well, I just love to remind everybody, if you are all ready to adjourn, before you adjourn, I just want to remind everyone that the full board meeting will be on March 30th at 10:30 a.m. and that meeting will be virtual, and we're working to set up meetings for the rest of the year, and that we still have the post subcommittee meeting on March 7th and the stop data on March 10th. And if you all have any further items now before we adjourn, check.
Nothing from board member LaWanda. Nope.
I'm seeing head shakes from all of the board members. So if you're all ready to adjourn, I think we can adjourn, and we have our tasks and research for the next subcommittee meeting, and we can present you with the information that we find in these areas.
Okay.
Thank you.
Do we have